Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll discuss about catching the king in the middle of the board. That's a very serious issue in openings, to follow the recommendation to castle as early as possible, which is definitely the right thing to do almost all the time. I'll show you some examples when one side or the other doesn't do it timely, and then it's too late. The first example I'd like to share with you is a very famous game by the late Bobby Fischer and the Hungarian international master Deli. Here is how the game started. Sicilian defense, open variation, and both sides so far are making standard developing moves. And here Fischer chose the Sozin variation of the Sicilian by developing the bishop to c4, which was his favorite place in many Sicilians. e6, and the bishop retreated to b3 to be on a protected square, and black responded by a6, preparing a future b5 move. And Fischer continued with f4, which is a very typical move for such Sicilians, preparing a future e5 move. And black here played a little bit strange move, getting the queen out, I think, a little prematurely, playing queen a5, creating a pin on white's knight on c3, threatening immediately to capture a pawn on e4. Fischer solved those problems by simply castling, and now there is no more pin, and therefore the pawn on e4 is not in danger. And now the game became interesting. After this trade of knights on d4, Deli played d5, which was a mistake. It's a premature aggressiveness on black's side. Of course, the idea of this move is tricky, threatening to bring the bishop out to c5 and creating a pin over white's king and queen. Therefore, naturally, white will not capture this pawn on d5. But Fischer responded with playing bishop to e3. As we can see, white has fully developed, castled, while black still is far behind development. The black king is right in the middle of the board, and the two black bishops are still undeveloped. Now that the white bishop has developed to e3, and black no longer has the threat to create a pin over the white queen, the pawn on d5 is in trouble. So black needs to do something. Black in the game continued by knight capturing on e4. Let's see for a moment what would happen if black would again try that same trick by playing knight g4. So if now white would be careless and takes the pawn on d5, then would try to trade, and then use the same pinning idea with bishop c5. Of course, white can do better than that, and after knight g4, simply move the king to the corner and get out of the pinning problem. Queen takes back, and now pawn takes on e4 and queen takes on e4. Now, sadly for black, after bishop e7 in attempt to castle, white's position is too strong, and white can choose between two tempting options. One is to check, when black cannot block the check with the pawn without losing the rook in the corner, or block the check with the bishop, which would also be not a good idea, because after trade, not only that black loses the right to castle, but also the queen gets to capture the pawn on b7. And going back to this position after bishop e7, in addition to bishop a4, white could even choose to play calmly, occupying the open file, and even though black gets to castle, after f5, white would be winning a pawn using the pin, using the fact that the black bishop on e7 is on an unprotected square. Let's go back to the game that reached this position, and black did not play knight g4 but chose to capture the pawn on e4. Now it's important in such situations that the side that wants to take advantage of the opponent staying behind in development or not castling timely makes aggressive, energetic moves. And that's what Bobby Fischer did in this game. He continued by trading knights, not leaving black much of a choice but to recapture with the pawn. And now, of course, white could capture the pawn on e4, but that would leave a little bit of breathing time for black to develop. Therefore, Bobby played a lot more energetically and better. Played f5 right away. One of the most important things to remember in such situations is trying to open files against the king and keeping the opponent busy, oftentimes even at the cost of sacrificing a pawn or two or even a piece at times. In the actual game, black here continued by trying to exchange queens and played queen to b4. But before we go further with that game, let's see what could happen after pawn captures pawn on f5. Here again, white has several tempting ways to continue. One is a little bit strange looking g4 that seems to weaken white's own king side. Nevertheless, the black pieces are very far from there and don't have a realistic way to get to. Of course, now the f5 pawn is under attack, and if it would capture on g4, that would enable white to capture on f7, for example, with the bishop and reach a completely winning position. In addition to the option of playing g4, white can play bishop a4 check in this position, and after b5, give another check on e5 for a change. And now, after bishop e7, the pawn on g7 would be hanging, or after bishop e6, white would respond with bishop b3 with an extremely strong attack again. Going back to the game, black played here queen b4, which is a very good idea in general, trying to trade queens. Whenever you are under attack or your king has trouble getting into safety or to castle, exchanging queens would solve a lot of those dangers, a lot of those problems. Because even if the king is in the middle of the board, if the queens are gone, all of a sudden it may in fact be even an advantage having the king in the middle of the board rather than a problem. So therefore, trading queens for white right now should definitely be out of question, and white should try to decide this game in the middle game before the black king would ever get to castle. Of course, very often the game doesn't end with a straight checkmate, but it ends with a significant material gain. Here Fischer continued by capturing the pawn on e6. Now if black would trade queens on d4, then white would have an intermediate move, winning a pawn by capturing on f7, and only then to recapture the queen. And now white is not only up a pawn, but what a pawn it is! A pawn on f7 that's very stable, guarded by the bishop, as well as the rook, is a future queen. Also at the same time, the black pawn on e4 is very weak, is likely to get lost very soon, and in addition, the black king is also in a very delicate position on e7, despite the fact that the queens are off the board. Let's go back to the actual game, which continued in this position by black recapturing with the bishop. And again, white captured on e6, not leaving black time to do the much desired trade of queens, because again white would have an intermediate move by capturing the pawn on f7. And after king moves out of the check, bishop takes, leaving white a full bishop ahead. Instead, black simply recaptured. Now things don't look so bad actually. Black is still a pawn ahead, black is offering to trade queens, and black managed to exchange a good number of pieces, even though not the queens. The less pieces on the board, the less important it is for black to castle. But black still is in trouble. Try to sit back and figure out what is the winning sequence right now that Fischer found. In this critical moment of the game, Fischer continued with a very elegant combination, sacrificing the rook for a bishop, using the moment that the only piece that can safely recapture on f8 is the queen, as otherwise the black queen would be lost. Therefore, black captured with the queen, and now comes another beautiful move, simple but pretty, queen a4. Check. Now the black king is trouble wherever it goes. If it would go, for example, on e7, white would proceed with bishop to c5. Or if it would step on the f-file, the white rook would simply move to f1 and create a skewer that way. Going to d8 would not bring much happiness either, followed by the bishop check on b6, and the queen check on c4. Black, therefore, in this position, resigned. You may wonder, though, why didn't he play b5? Well, in that case, Fischer planned the following. Capture the pawn on e4, attacking the rook. Rook moves away, and then, even better than capturing the pawn on e6, rather check on c6. Again, the king cannot safely move out of the check because of the skewers already shown in previous variations. Rook blocks the check, and now white keeps pressuring on the pinned rook by rook d1. Black protects the rook, and now, amazingly, white makes a quiet but decisive move. This is a very important position, by the way, because white has several options to go wrong. And again, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out what white should do here. The first thing, if white would play queen c8 check, black would have an option to block. How about, on the other hand, going back to this position, if white would play the bishop to c5? Looks like an aggressive move, a decisive move. Yet it would be a major mistake, because black would get the opportunity to sacrifice his queen for the bishop, and when, with a check, importantly, when the queen captures the queen, then rook captures rook with a check, and black is at least hanging on for now, having two rooks for a queen. Another interesting moment is that if the bishop tries the same from the other side on g5 with the idea that queen takes and then queen takes rook's check, rook f1 and then checkmate, then black can do much better as well. After bishop g5, try to figure out black's move here. A brilliant, beautiful move to simply castle. And if now bishop takes queen, it is black who checkmates by rook takes rook. Or if white captures the black rook, then black can capture the white bishop and remain in the game. So what should white do in this key position? The solution is an amazing quiet move, moving the bishop to b6, with the threat on the next move to play queen c8 check, now that the black rook cannot interpose conveniently, and also black cannot get out of the pin, because as soon as black would, for example, castle, white would already be free to capture the rook with a rook gain. A brilliant game of the American chess genius Bobby Fischer. Okay, let's move on to the next example, which is played by one of the best attacking players of his time, Spillman, against Flamberg back from 1914. This game started with king pawns openings and continued in an aggressive way. I'm not going to spend much time on the opening moves. Here white played queen e2, which is an unusual move, moving the queen out so early, with the idea to provoke the trade between the knights. And black followed with knight c5 and came d4. And here black made a mistake. He should have retreated the knight, but instead he captured the knight on f3, based on the idea that after white recaptures, they'll play queen h4, creating a fork and winning the pawn on d4. But white went along with this idea on purpose. White did not mind sacrificing a couple of pawns in order to get a lead in development, while the black king stays in the middle of the board. The idea is catch the king in the middle. So now white had to make an important choice, whether to play aggressively and sacrifice the pawn, or block with the queen with queen f2 and go for an endgame. While white would be slightly better also in the endgame, it's a lot more ambitious and objectively better to play g3 and sacrifice the pawn. And now white gains time by developing the bishop, with attacking the queen at the same time. Queen captured the pawn on e5, and white got to castle. The black king is still not ready to castle. In the meantime, white is threatening to capture the d5 pawn with attacking the queen with a tempo. Black was greedy and wanted to hang on to his pawn on d5. And this is the important point, that in such situations there is no time to play peacefully and slowly. For example, developing the last undeveloped piece, the bishop on f1. Time for action, because the time may never come back. White sacrificed the knight on d5, keeping black busy. Black captured and rook captured, attacking the queen. Now the queen has numerous places to go to, but none of them escapes trouble. In the game, black moved the queen back to e6, but let's see some other options. After queen c7, white would have responded with bishop f4, attacking the queen again and opening the e-file. The idea is, in the following moves, to get the bishop out and the rook out with all tempos, attacking the black king. Or, in another variation, here, if the black queen would go to e4, then white would respond with a check, and after knight c6, white can and should sacrifice the queen by playing bishop to c5, capturing the knight, because if queen captures queen, then there is a forceful checkmate by 1. Can you see the rest? 2 and 3 and discover check and checkmate. Very pretty. Let's go back and see how the game itself ended when black moved his queen back to e6. White continued with bishop c4, creating a discovery check of rook to d8 to win the black queen. Here, black already tried to trade queens, but again, a similar idea as in the previous variation. The response was bishop takes knight, sacrificing the queen, and after the check, the checkmate follows real quick. And therefore, after bishop c5, black resigned. Now I'd like to share with you an example from my own practice. It's one of my all-time favorite combinations. I reached this position in a game back in Hungary against Hordicsai in 1985. I'm having a good position already, but my king is in a little bit sensitive position, losing the right to castle already. And here I found a way making sure the black king doesn't find safety. Had it already castled, I would not have had this opportunity. This is what I did. Bishop b5 check, making sure my rook gets into the game with a tempo real quick. He captured my bishop, and I brought my rook to the game. Next, checking the king again. The king moved towards the king's side. If it would have moved to the other side, my plan was to check, and after the queen blocks, rook e7, winning the black queen. Let's go back. So, after I sacrificed my bishop and brought my rook to the game, the king went to the other side. And then I played bishop h6. You can see now how the king is in an unfortunate square, locking the rook into the corner. And now I played a fine move by blocking the black queen's way to getting out with a check and creating a fork to my king and bishop. Now, if the queen captures the rook, my queen would capture the knight on b8 and black would get a back-rank checkmate. My opponent responded with bishop to d7. So now my rook is in danger because after queen takes rook, queen takes knight, the black queen or bishop could block on e8. But here I spotted one of the most beautiful combinations I ever got a chance to perform. To sacrifice my queen for just a knight and then follow it up with a quiet move. This is extremely rare, and yet black is helpless. My opponent resigned. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week, a beautiful position just like this. Here we are. Well, I'm not saying that you'll reach this position every day in your games, but nevertheless, the idea is very instructive and extremely beautiful. Well, what's the challenge here? White is up a queen and a pawn. Yet the problem is, black is about to promote his B pawn, and after that, the A pawn is also real close to getting promoted. White only has one way to win this game. Try to figure out what that is. And here is the solution. White pins the pawn, so in the meantime it cannot promote. Black's only move now is to move out of the corner and threaten to promote the other pawn, the A2 pawn. Now white gives a check, forces back the king to the corner, and uses the zigzag pattern to move up to where the queen needs and wants to be. Again, the black pawn is pinned, king goes to b1, and again check, and as you can see, the white queen is elegantly zigzagging up with the same theme, pinning the pawn and then checking the king, not leaving black the time to promote either pawn. Beautifully zigzagging up along the two diagonals, and here we are. But why did we do all of this? Here is why. The queen zigzagged up all the way to the corner, and after black's only move, here comes the checkmate. Beautiful, isn't it? Well, remember, castle as soon as you can to avoid being caught in the middle of the board and getting in trouble. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.